Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Tim on the Fly. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about and tying a microclouser. I've done a few videos lately where I've featured this fly pretty prominently in my fishing. In fact, I've done a couple of videos just specifically on fishing the microclouser. And so a couple of people have asked me if I'd do a tying video. I was kind of hesitant to do that because, well, there's a million Clouser Minnow tying videos out there, and the microclouser ties pretty much the same as the regular clousers do, just on a smaller scale. But there are some differences, so I thought I would just talk a little bit about those, and then we'd do a real quick tie-up at the end, and there you'd have it. So your standard Clouser Minnow, Bob Clouser called this a process rather than a pattern, because there's a lot of different things you can do with it, but the traditional pattern is usually layers of bucktail, a barbell eye of some sort, and some flash in the middle, and that's really about all there is to it. When I go down to the microclousers, when I tie down quite a bit smaller, typically a regular clouser, will be anywhere from gigantic to a 6 or maybe a 4 hook. With my microclousers, the hook you see here is a 12. I go clear down to 16s on them. And so a few things have to change. Well, they don't really have to change, but I found a few things that work easier. You could still use bucktail, for instance, at this stage, but I have found that it seems like an awful waste of material with the bucktail. At this length, keeping the tips even enough that you've got the proper profile becomes a bit of a problem. So what I've found that works a little better is calf tail. The calf tail is still going to have the bulk, it's still going to have the taper at a shorter length that's going to be easier to work with on these size flies. It's available in just as many colors as bucktail is. I think I've got about a 1-to-1 match in my materials collection of calf tail colors and bucktail colors. It's got a kind of an interesting translucence to it in the white. The dyed kind of loses that, but in the white you've got an interesting translucence in the water that almost kind of reminds me of polar bear, which of course you have a hard time getting anymore and would also not be real effective at this size. But it adds kind of a little bit to the way the fly looks in the water. If you get much smaller, this one, like I said, is a 12. If you get down to 14s and 16s, a lot of times rabbit body hair can be a good way to go too, if you can find a patch of rabbit that's got some fairly long hair like this one does. This was just a craft store hide that I found, but you can see we'll dampen that down a little so it'll stay put, but you can see there's quite a bit of length there, so we can use this material too in a clouser, and on a really small clouser it's just going to have a ton of movement to it even when you're moving the clouser slowly, so that's going to be a good way to go too. For the barbell eyes, on the bigger clousers I like to use the nickel eyes because they hold up a lot better. You can bounce them off the rocks and things, and the material's not going to wear away like lead eyes would. You can get the cool painted pupils in a lot of different colors. Those types of eyes are hard to find in the sizes you need for the microclouser though, so when I get down to this size I'm going back to just the lead eyes, usually either painted black or unpainted. It doesn't seem to matter. The fish don't seem to care one way or another. But you can get these down to minis and micros. This is the mini, the micro is even a size smaller. And those are going to tie in, they're going to be proportionate, and they're going to get a little more weight on the fly than nickel would in the same size, so the smaller fly is going to get down a little easier as well. The third material, the flash material, I will tend to, instead of regular crystal flash, which works great on the bigger flies and is the material that Bob Clouser seems to prefer for his flies, I'll go down and we'll go to what's called midge flash, which is exactly the same thing as crystal flash. It's just done in a very, very small diameter. So you can control the amount of material you can get. The thinner material is going to move better. It's not going to be as stiff, and in these littler flies that becomes a little bit more important. So those are just some of the basic things. One other thing I forgot to mention that I really like to use a lot of at this size besides the calf tail is squirrel tail. Gray squirrel, red squirrel can give you a lot of different effects. The red squirrel does a really nice baby crayfish type of impression. And you can get squirrel tail in a number of different dyed colors as well. You usually tend with the squirrel, you tend to get a nice variegation. I don't have a squirrel tail with me right now, or I'd show you, but you get a nice variegation in the colors that can do some neat things for you too. So that's basically the difference between a regular clouser and a microclouser. So let's get to the tying. Okay, so actually tying the microclouser isn't any different than tying a regular Clouser minnow, except for it's basically a matter of scale. Instead of a larger streamer hook, we're going to be tying this one on a size 12 Kona dry fly hook. Wouldn't have to be a dry fly hook, it could be a nymph hook, it could be a heavier wire nymph hook or something. I just really like this hook because of the gap to shank ratio. One of the things with the smaller flies, of course, we've probably already mentioned, is that the smaller the hook, the smaller the gap, and so you want to keep that gap as wide as you can for purposes of getting a good hookup on the fish, because a lot of times bigger fish will attack these smaller flies. So we're going to start with that size 12 hook. We're going to be using Vivas 6/0, in this case in a white, but otherwise colored to suit whatever colors you're going to be using. We're going to start that thread about 1/3 to 1/2 of a way back on the hook. We're just going to make a little knob there, and then we're going to cut that thread tag off. And that looks like an awful long way back on the hook, but it really isn't, and we're going to see that here pretty quick. We're going to take a barbell eye, just a simple lead barbell eye. I believe this is a mini. You could go down to a micro if you wanted to, if you needed a little less weight. I just like the way it looks, and I like a little more weight on the smaller ones to help get them down, so we're going to go with a mini instead of the micro on this one. I get down a couple more sizes. I start doing 14s, maybe 16s, then I'm definitely going to go down to the micro. We're just going to lash that on there really quickly, making sure that we get it on nice and snug and nice and even. Want to make sure that's perpendicular, so we're going to take that series of X wraps there. Once we get it the way we like it, then we're going to take some perpendicular wraps to help snug that up. Person could drop a little super glue on there if they wanted to just absolutely make sure, but I find it's more than snug enough with just the wraps. And then we're going to take some calf tail on this one. If I were going much smaller than this, we may switch over to bunny tail, but we're going to go calf tail. And since Clouser minnows run in the water upside down, the top of the hook is going to be the belly of the fly. So we're going to want to look at the lighter color for the belly of the fly, and we're going to go with white calf tail here. Calf tail handles very similar to bucktail, it's just shorter and a little bit bushier, so you get the bulk without nearly as much material. And we're going to measure that out so that our overall fly is about twice the shank of the hook length. So we're just going to measure that out, and we're going to tie that down. And we're not going to tie very far back. We're just going to anchor that right behind the eye, because I want all that movement, I want that bulk back there, I want that profile. Then we're going to pull it over to the front. We're going to take a couple of more wraps, just enough to make sure that that's down there snug. We don't want to lay in a lot of thread right now. And then we're going to take this and we're going to cut this extra off, but as we do it, we're not going to go in and we're just not going to cut straight, because we don't want to make a bump. We don't want to have a ridge in there. We're going to come in and we're going to go at a bias. We're going to come in at an angle with those scissors and cut that way so that our hair is sloping. Now we can come in with our thread. We get a nice taper. Looks like we didn't get quite close enough there, so we can come in and we can just kind of grab that and with our scissor blades and snip it back just a little bit away from the eye of the hook. Want to make sure that eye stays clear. That's why we set the eyes. That's why we set the lead eyes so far back, is so that we can tie all our materials in and still have the eye of the hook nice and clear. So now we've got the belly on this fly. We're just going to roll it over in the vise. And we're going to take a little midge flash, midge flash, And we're just going to take about 3 or 4 strands of that midge flash, just like we would crystal flash on a bigger one. Take 3 or 4 strands, cut those off. We're going to double them over. And then we're going to set that in there probably just a little bit longer than the calf tail we set in, so that that flash, we want that flash to run all the way through the body of the fly. So we're going to set that in there, tie that down. Just going to take about 2 wraps real quick just to seat it. Kind of tease that material, make sure it's where we want it. Get a couple more wraps on. And then we can take that, get in there with our scissors and cut off the excess on that. A couple more wraps just to make sure we got everything where we want it. Tease that around to both sides of the hook so that when we lay our next layer on, it's going to lay in evenly. And then we're going to take our main color. In this case, it's going to be chartreuse. We're going to find ourselves some fairly long fibers, but we're tying on a small hook so they don't have to be very long. And again, we're going to take a relatively small clump of those. Again, about the same length as the stuff we put on the top. We're just going to set that down on top. Again, kind of tease that around. Get a couple of wraps there just to make sure we have it nice and snug. We don't want to crowd that. We want to be able to have plenty of room here to get in here and trim this off nice and close. Again, at a bias. Come in, trim away from the eye of the hook. Start to wrap that down. Looks like we got a piece of flash trying to get away, so we'll just fold that back and wrap it back in too. And really, we're just about done there. Pretty simple, pretty easy. That's the one thing I love about Clouser Minnows, is there's not very complicated. We're just going to throw a real quick whip finish on this. Not going to have to be too careful with that, because it's really, we're going to reinforce this a little bit with some UV resin, so that doesn't have to be trimmed too close. I'm going to roll this over back up top. We're going to get out our resin. And we're going to be very careful here that we stay clear of the eye of the hook. So we don't want to close the eye of the hook. We're just going to put just a tiny bit of resin over the top. And just hit above and below that hook. Just to kind of seal those threads, because they're going to be bouncing along rocks and things like that. And I'm going to take my bodkin and just make sure that eye is clear before I set this. Get our lamp out. Set it up. Should just take a couple of seconds. We can get in there, and looks like we've got a few stray hairs, so we'll get in there and get rid of those. And there we've got our finished Microclouser. We're ready to go fish.